The unexpected visit. Ethan Carter tapped his fingers against the steering wheel, his eyes flicking between the winding road ahead and the message still glowing on his phone screen. Come visit me. It's been too long. The sender, Lena Mitchell. The name alone was enough to stir something deep within him, something he wasn't sure he wanted to face. The last time they had spoken was years ago, before life settled into its predictable rhythm, before marriage, before responsibility, before he had to pretend that he wasn't still haunted by the memory of her laugh, the way her eyes could pull him in like an undertow. Now, the invitation felt like a whisper from a past he had long buried. He should have ignored it. But Rachel, his wife, had barely looked at him in weeks, her presence in their home more like a ghost's than a partner's. Their conversations were clipped, their silences heavy. And so, instead of turning back, he drove deeper into the countryside, toward a place he told himself was just a piece of nostalgia. When Ethan arrived, the sunflower field stretched out before him like a golden sea, the balloons swaying gently in the breeze. The house, a modest cottage at the field's edge, still carried the same rustic charm he remembered. Then she stepped outside. Lena. Time had been kind to her. She was older, yes, but the years had only softened her in a way that made her presence feel even more magnetic. Her chestnut hair was pulled into a loose braid, strands falling carelessly over her shoulders. When she smiled, it was as if the years between them had vanished. "You actually came," she said, leaning against the porch railing, her voice a mixture of amusement and something else, something unreadable. "I almost didn't," Ethan admitted, pocketing his phone. She tilted her head, studying him. "But you did." He didn't have an answer for that. Inside, the house smelled of vanilla and aged wood, just as he remembered. The late afternoon light filtered through sheer curtains, casting golden shadows along the walls. Ethan sat at the kitchen table while Lena poured 2 glasses of wine, her movements unhurried, deliberate. "So," she said, sliding a glass toward him, "how's married life?" Ethan exhaled through his nose, a humorless smile tugging at his lips. "Complicated." Lena lifted her glass, swirling the wine before taking a slow sip. "Isn't it always?" He watched her, his grip tightening around the stem of his glass. There was something about the way she looked at him, like she could still read him, still see through whatever careful mask he had constructed over the years. "How long has it been?" she asked. 8 years. Since we last spoke? Since I last saw you." She leaned back in her chair, eyes narrowing slightly. "You left without saying goodbye." Ethan looked away, guilt settling in his chest like a weight. "It felt easier that way. For you, maybe." A thick silence followed. He wanted to tell her that it wasn't easy, that walking away from her had been one of the hardest things he'd ever done. But what good would that do now? As the evening deepened, they wandered outside. The sunflower field stretched endlessly, the scent of earth and summer air wrapping around them. Lena walked ahead, brushing her fingers along the tall stalks, her expression unreadable. "You know," she said, glancing over her shoulder, "I used to dream about this." "About what?" "You showing up here again. About us talking like this." Ethan swallowed, his pulse quickening. "And how did those dreams end?" She stopped, turning to face him fully. "That depends," she said softly. "Are you still the same man I knew back then?" The question settled between them, heavy and unanswered. Ethan wanted to say yes, but the truth was he wasn't sure anymore. And for the first time in years, he wasn't certain if that was a good or bad thing. The crossing of boundaries. The last sliver of sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of amber and indigo. Ethan and Lena stood at the edge of the sunflower field, the distant hum of crickets filling the silence between them. The air was thick, charged with something unspoken, something both dangerous and familiar. Lena sighed, wrapping her arms around herself as the evening breeze whispered through the tall stalks. "You didn't answer my question." Ethan glanced at her, jaw tightening. "Which one?" Her lips curled slightly, though her eyes remained unreadable. "Are you still the same man I knew back then?" He exhaled, raking a hand through his hair. "I don't know." Lena stepped closer, her gaze locked onto his, searching. "I think you do." Ethan's breath hitched. He should have walked away then, should have turned back toward his car, toward the life he had built. But instead, he stood there, unmoving, his pulse thrumming beneath his skin. Lena reached up, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. The touch was feather-light, but it sent a current through him. He didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. "I've missed you," she murmured. Ethan closed his eyes. He could still remember the way she used to say those words, years ago, when they were just on the cusp of something neither of them had dared name. Back then, he had walked away before it could happen. Now, he wasn't sure he had the strength to do it again. They wandered back toward the house, their steps slow, measured. The space between them had shrunk to something almost imperceptible. Inside, the glow of the fireplace flickered against the walls. Lena poured another glass of wine, but Ethan barely touched his. His mind was a storm, his body tense with a pull he couldn't ignore. She sat across from him, studying him in the dim light. "You look tired." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "I feel tired." Lena reached out, placing a hand over his. Her fingers were warm, steady. "You don't have to pretend with me, Ethan." His throat tightened. "I'm not pretending." Her grip on his hand tightened slightly. "Then tell me," she said, voice softer now. "Are you happy?" Ethan hesitated, staring at their joined hands. He thought of Rachel, her distant eyes, the walls that had built up between them, the love that had dulled into something unrecognizable. He lifted his gaze to Lena's, and for the first time in a long time, he told the truth.